They bring a man before the prophet. His hands are dyed red. His feet are dyed red henna, the exact shade a bride wears. Someone in the crowd asks to kill him. The prophet says, no, not because of who this man is. Because he prays. He is exiled instead. Not into legend, into a real place, 3 miles outside Medina, with a name on a map. This is not a story about a record that went silent. Every person in it has a name, a job, a specific place they were sent. Let's get one thing straight. The Hadith did not erase this man. Something that came centuries later did, and it never had to touch a single word of the text to do it. The word is mukhannath. Plural, mukhannathūn. It means, roughly, one who acts feminine, and in the Hijaz, in the 1st century of Islam, it was not an insult whispered behind a hand, it was a job description. Everett Rowson, Journal of the American Oriental Society, 1991, spent 23 pages reconstructing what that job actually was. His conclusion, in his own words, a publicly recognized and institutionalized role. Not underground, registered. Mukhannathūn were allowed into women's quarters that were closed to every other man on one assumption: that they had no sexual interest in the women they were left alone with. They became matchmakers, go-betweens. And, more than either of those in Medina, specifically the most celebrated musicians in the city, and when the state did crack down on them, which happened more than once, over the following century, Rowson is specific about why. Not because officials had decided these men were secretly gay. In his own words, those measures were not based on any conclusions about their own sexual status at all. The complaint was about the job, musicians and go-betweens, activities the state considered corrupting to public morals. You could lose your place in this city for what you did for a living. Not, at first, for what anyone assumed about who you slept with. 2 of them have names you can still say out loud today. One built a career, one got exiled by name, in a hadith, on purpose. Start with the musician. His name, according to most of the sources that survived, was Abu Abdal-Munim, Isa ibn Abdallah. Nobody called him that. They called him Ṭuways, Little Peacock. He is, by Rowson's account, the first of the mukhannathūn in Medina to sing what the sources call perfect music, fully realized rhythm, not the looser style that came before him. He is credited as the first person in Islam to compose in 2 specific rhythmic modes. His instrument was the tambourine. Before him, that instrument belonged to women. He is one of the reasons it stopped only belonging to women. He wasn't performing alone. At one event, for a woman named Jamila, 8 mukhannathūn took the stage across 2 days, in a set order: Heet first, then Tuways, then Al-Dalal, then 5 more whose names survive and almost nothing else does. Rowson could tell us who stood where. He couldn't tell us anything else about most of them. A whole subculture, and for 5 of these men, a name is the entire biography that made it through. He married. He had children. On this point, the sources agree completely, and they almost never agree completely. There is exactly one source, one that calls him something else. A single writer 2 centuries later generalizing from one throwaway line. Rowson read that source and doubted it out loud, in print, in 1991. So, here is what actually survives about Ṭuways' private life. Almost nothing. What survives about his public one? He was, by every early account, the funniest, unluckiest man in Medina, and the unlucky part became a saying. Proverb books say he was born the day the Prophet died, weaned the day Abu Bakr died, circumcised the day Umar was assassinated, married the day Uthman was assassinated, had his first child the day Ali was assassinated. 5 of the worst days in early Islamic history, and this one man's biography is stapled to every single one of them. There's a saying for it: more unlucky than Ṭuways. It outlived him by centuries. Rowson's own note on this: treat it as literature, not chronicle. Nobody thinks it's literally true. Everybody kept repeating it anyway. Now the other one. The Hadith names. Salama, one of the Prophet's wives, reported that on the eve of a military campaign, in the year 630, a mukhannath was present in her rooms. He said to her brother, "If God grants you if tomorrow, go after Ghaylan's daughter." She comes forward with 4, she goes away with 8. The commentators spent centuries explaining that line. It's about the folds of a woman's stomach, visible from the front, visible from the side as she turns. 4. Then 8. The Prophet's response, in the version al-Bukhārī recorded, do not admit these into your presence. He is the only early source who gives this man a name at all. He calls him Heet. A parallel version through Aisha, not Salama, recorded by Abu Dawood, says something close but not identical. He was one of those they assumed had no interest in women at all. Then the Prophet realized this one clearly did have an interest, or at least the vocabulary of one, and the door closed on him. Say the number back to me. This is not one hadith. It is a cluster, different wives reporting it, different chains carrying it, all landing on the same 4 words and 8 words. That's not the sound of a story someone tried to bury. That's the sound of something that got repeated on purpose, by multiple people, because it mattered. According to 2 of the major legal commentators who studied this centuries later, at least 5 differently named mukhannathūn were banished by Muhammad to 6 different locations between them. Eat, Mati, Anna, all, Admin, all, Ver. 5 names. 6 places. This is not a redacted file. This is an over-documented one. It gets more over-documented than that. There's a real dispute, going back to a 10th century linguist named Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad, over whether Heet is even the right way to read this man's name. He argued the dots were misplaced, and the name should be read Hinbi. One later grammarian backed him. Another, al-Azhari, argued back. And separately, commentators spent a long time arguing over whether Heet and Mati were 2 different exiled men, or one man remembered under 2 names. Nobody settled it. It's still sitting there, unresolved, in the commentary literature, which is a strange thing to say about a man some people insist history tried to erase. So here's the part that should bother you. Everett Rowson, the same scholar, same 1991 paper, says this, and I am going to say it exactly the way he wrote it, because it's the whole argument. An automatic link between the mukhannathūn of the Hijaz and homosexuality can therefore by no means be assumed. Read that again. The scholar whose entire career is built on this material is telling you, stop assuming you know what this word meant. Because 2 9th and 10th century writers Ibn Thababib and al-Tabarani are, by Rowson's own account, the first people on record to explicitly separate effeminate from homosexual, which only makes sense as a distinction if, by their time, people had already started collapsing the 2. Nobody rewrote the hadith, nobody torched the manuscript. The text of "do not admit these into your presence" is identical in the 9th century and the 7th. What changed is who got to decide what that sentence was secretly about. By the time you get to the later jurists, the ones writing legal commentary generations after Rowson's earliest sources, mukhannath has, in a lot of usage, simply come to mean the receptive partner in sex between men. Full stop. That's not a footnote to the original meaning. That's a replacement of it. And the record just sitting there, unedited, letting them do it. This is the mechanism. Not a fire. Not a ban on the book. A slow transfer of interpretive custody from the people who wrote the hadith down to the people who, centuries later, got to decide what it was secretly evidence of. Nobody asked Heet. He'd been dead for hundreds of years by the time the second group started arguing about him. Here is where it gets ugly, and I want to be honest with you about exactly how ugly. Ibn Khalakhan, a medieval biographer, says Tuways died in the year 711, at 82. Very specific, very clean. The kind of number a listicle would put in a caption and move on. But the Kitab al-Aghani, a different, and in places earlier, source says he died sometime during the reign of a different caliph, al-Walid, whose reign didn't even start until 705 and ran to 715, not the same window, not even close to the same certainty. And then there's a third problem, and it's the one that actually matters. Later anecdotes, the ones about a caliph named Sulayman, who by every account did order a wave of persecution against the mukhannathūn of Medina, put Tuways in the room. Sulayman's reign didn't start until 715. After both of the dates above, I am not going to pick one for you. I could hand you 711 and a clean age of 82 and let the video move on. It would sound more confident. It would also be a number I can't actually stand behind because the same scholar who gave it to me, on the same page, hands me a second date that contradicts it. And then, later in his own article, a third source that puts this man alive for events the first date makes impossible. Rowson's own words about this exact cluster of stories, too riddled with variance and chronological improbabilities to warrant belief in the historicity of any single account. A scholar spent 23 pages building the most careful account of this man's life that exists in English, and his conclusion is, don't trust any one version of how it ends. That's not a gap in his research. That's the most honest sentence in the whole paper. Now, before you leave here thinking every mukhannath in Medina got the same treatment, the same silence, the same ambiguity, they didn't. And flattening them into one story is exactly the kind of thing this channel refuses to do. Take Al-Dalal, real name Nafid, one of Tuways' own students. Same legal status as him, a freedman. His nickname means something like the coquette. Where Tuways gets almost total silence about his sex life, Al-Dalal gets the opposite. One source, Famza al-Isfahani, quotes him directly, claiming, in his own words, that the devil made me like it. Rowson doesn't doubt this one the way he doubts the Tuways claim. It's treated as part of Al-Dalal's actual public persona, not a stray line generalized from nothing. Same teacher, same job, same city. Two completely different relationships to the one question everyone keeps asking about this group. That's not a contradiction in the record. That's the record telling you these were individuals, not a category. And here's the part where the exile story gets messier, not cleaner, the harder you look. Where was Heet actually sent? One line of sources through Ibn al-Kalbi says al-Imma. A completely separate proverb book tradition, Jamza al-Isfahani, again says a different place entirely, Khakh. And who let him back into the city? One version says Abu Bakr refused to reconsider the sentence, and it was Umar, years later, old and sick, who finally allowed him in once a week to beg. A parallel version, same original source, different transmission, says it was Uthman who relented, not Umar. I am not going to tell you which caliph showed mercy, because the sources that survive don't agree. And a channel that quietly picks the cleaner version and doesn't tell you it did, that is a channel doing exactly what got this man erased in the first place, deciding what the record secretly means on his behalf without him in the room. One more thing, because I don't want you walking away from this thinking it's a romance. It isn't. A man describing a woman's body to her brother, in detail, without her consent, in her own home, that's not queer liberation history. That's a violation of a woman's privacy that got a man banished. Ghaylan's daughter doesn't get a name in this story. She gets measured. Let's not pretend that's charming. And it wasn't only Medina. Around the same years, in Mecca, a different governor, Nafiq ibn Alqama al-Kinani, issued his own crackdown on singers and mukhannathūn. Only two names survive from it. Ibn Siraj, who apparently played cat and mouse with the man and got away with it, and his student Al-Gharida, who didn't he fled to Yemen and never came back. Same empire, same decade, two cities, two different outcomes. One man escaped, one man ran and stayed gone. There is no single what happened to the mukhannathūn. There's a set of individual men, each with his own ending, and a channel that tells you they all suffered the same fate is skipping the part where some of them got away with it. One story I'm not going to tell you tonight, and I want to explain why. A few years after all this, around 715, a caliph named Sulayman did something to the mukhannathūn of Medina that Rowson himself calls abrupt and violent, something severe enough that it ended their prominence in the city's music for good. There's a popular version of what that something was, specific, gruesome, even a joke one of them supposedly made in the moment. I went looking for it in Rowson's own footnotes, because I don't repeat a detail like that without seeing the scholar's own sentence. 6 different copies of his article, 5 different websites. Every single one of them cuts off 2 pages before the story starts. So here's what I can actually stand behind. It happened, it was violent, and after it, the record itself goes quiet. What I can't stand behind is the joke, so I'm not going to perform it for you. This is not a love story, and it's not a punchline either. It's a silence I found while trying to fact-check one, and I'd rather hand you the silence honestly than the punchline I can't source. So, the mukhannathūn of early Medina, named in the Hadith, named in the proverb books, named enough that scholars are still arguing, 14 centuries later, over which of 2 towns one of them was exiled to. The record did not fail them. The record is, if anything, unusually stubborn about them. What failed, what actually erased something, was quieter than a fire, and it didn't need permission from anyone holding a match. It was every reader, for 1,000 years after, who inherited the exact same sentences Rowson read and decided, without changing a single word of them, that they now meant something the first people who wrote them down never assumed. They have always been here. Named, argued over. Read differently by every generation that got to hold the pen. Tuways died once, or twice, depending on which source you trust, on a date nobody can fully defend. That's not a hole in the record. That's the record, honestly reported. Thank you to our family watching from Chicago. Welcome to Petty Past. The history class you were owed.